Mark had always dreamed of traveling to London. For years, he'd saved up money from his job at a small-town hardware store, imagining the cobblestone streets, grand castles, and bustling markets he would explore. Finally, the day came when he boarded a plane for the first time in his life. As the aircraft soared above the clouds, Mark couldn't help but feel like an adventurer stepping into uncharted territory. He promised himself that this trip would be unforgettable. When Mark landed in London, the city greeted him with its signature mix of old-world charm and modern energy. Red double-decker buses zoomed past historic buildings, street musicians played cheerful tunes, and tourists snapped endless photos. Mark wasted no time diving into the excitement. Armed with a camera slung around his neck and a backpack filled with essentials, including a folded Confederate flag tucked inside as a quirky memento, he set off to explore. The Confederate flag wasn't something Mark carried out of malice or pride. It was more of a lighthearted keepsake. Back home in his small southern town, people often joked about the flag, using it as a symbol of regional identity, rather than thinking deeply about its history. Mark thought it might make for a funny photo prop during his travels. After all, who wouldn't find it amusing to see a piece of Americana against the backdrop of Buckingham Palace? On his second day in the city, Mark made his way to one of London's most iconic landmarks, Buckingham Palace. The palace stood majestically behind tall iron gates, surrounded by impeccably dressed royal guards, standing perfectly still in their red tunics and bearskin hats. Tourists gathered around, snapping pictures and trying to get the guards to crack a smile or move, even just a little. It was common knowledge that these soldiers were trained not to react, no matter what antics unfolded before them. As Mark joined the crowd, he watched others attempt to break the guards' stoic demeanor. Some waved brightly colored scarves in front of their faces, while others mimicked sneezes or pretended to trip nearby. Laughter rippled through the group whenever a guard remained completely unfazed. Inspired by the playful atmosphere, Mark decided to join in on the fun. Reaching into his bag, he pulled out the folded Confederate flag and unfurled it with a flourish. At first, Mark didn't think much of it. He held the flag high, waving it dramatically in front of one particular guard, expecting chuckles or maybe even a raised eyebrow. But as the fabric fluttered in the breeze, something unexpected happened. Instead of ignoring him like the other tourists, the guard's eyes locked onto Mark's face. There was no smile, no hint of amusement, just a sharp, piercing gaze that sent a chill down Mark's spine. For a moment, time seemed to freeze. Mark felt the weight of the guard's stare, noticing how the man's jaw tightened ever so slightly beneath his hat. Suddenly, the playful mood vanished, replaced by an uneasy tension. Other tourists paused mid-laugh, turning to see what had caused the shift. Mark lowered the flag slowly, suddenly unsure of himself. What had started as a harmless prank now felt strangely serious, and Mark had no idea why. Little did he know, this simple act would set off a chain of events that would leave him questioning everything about his choices and assumptions. Mark stood frozen, the Confederate flag dangling loosely from his hand. The guard's unwavering gaze seemed to pierce right through him, and for the first time that day, Mark felt a flicker of unease. He glanced around at the other tourists, hoping someone might laugh or nod in approval, but instead, he found curious and disapproving stares aimed his way. The lighthearted mood had evaporated entirely, leaving behind an awkward silence that hung heavy in the air. The guard Mark had chosen as his target was no ordinary soldier. His name was Corporal James Whittaker, a seasoned member of the British Army who had served for over a decade. Whittaker wasn't just standing there to look impressive. He took his duties seriously, viewing his role as a protector of tradition and dignity. Over the years, he'd encountered all sorts of antics from visitors. People poking fun, trying to distract him, or even throwing objects near his post. But nothing quite like this. To Whittaker, the sight of the Confederate flag stirred something deep within him, something rooted in history and respect. Though trained not to react visibly, Whittaker couldn't ignore what he saw before him. In his mind, the flag represented more than just a regional symbol from another country. It carried echoes of division, oppression, and pain. While Mark viewed it as a harmless novelty, Whittaker understood its weight on a global scale. For a brief second, Whittaker debated whether to let it slide, chalking it up to ignorance. But then he remembered where he stood, guarding one of the most revered institutions in the world. This was no place for such provocation. Breaking protocol ever so slightly, Whittaker leaned forward just enough to catch Mark's attention without stepping out of position. His voice, calm yet firm, cut through the quiet crowd. "Sir," he said, enunciating each word carefully, "remove that immediately." The tone left no room for argument, though it lacked hostility. It was the kind of authority that demanded obedience without raising a fist. Mark blinked, startled by the command. He hadn't expected any kind of response, let alone one so direct. Flustered, he tried to laugh it off, holding the flag closer to his chest. "Oh, come on," he said with a nervous chuckle. "It's just a joke. I didn't mean anything by it." But Whittaker didn't budge. If anything, his expression grew darker, his lips pressing into a thin line beneath his mustache. "This is not a joke," he replied, his voice steady but carrying an edge that made Mark's stomach tighten. "You're disrespecting my position and your surroundings. Remove it. Now." The words hit Mark like a punch to the gut. He looked around again, desperate for support, but the crowd only stared back at him, some shaking their heads in disappointment. A few people began whispering among themselves, their voices too low for Mark to hear clearly but loud enough to make him squirm. One older woman muttered loudly, "What a disgrace," while a young couple nearby exchanged glances and quickly moved away. Feeling cornered, Mark stammered, I didn't know. I thought it was funny." His attempt at explanation trailed off as Whittaker continued to hold his ground, unyielding. The longer the standoff lasted, the more Mark realized how out of place he truly was. What had seemed like a harmless prank moments ago now felt monumentally foolish. The playful grin he'd worn earlier faded completely, replaced by a mix of confusion, embarrassment, and growing dread. As the seconds ticked by, Mark noticed cameras pointed in his direction. Phones were held aloft, capturing every moment of the confrontation. At first, he assumed they were filming because of the unusual interaction between a tourist and a guard, but soon he realized the focus wasn't on Whittaker, it was on him. People weren't cheering him on or laughing along anymore. They were watching him squirm under the weight of his own mistake. Desperate to escape the spotlight, Mark hesitated, clutching the flag tightly. He wanted to explain himself, to tell them all that he hadn't meant harm, but the words caught in his throat. Whittaker's commanding presence loomed large, reminding him that excuses wouldn't change the situation. All eyes were on him now, waiting to see what he would do next. And for the first time since arriving in London, Mark wished he could disappear. Mark's heart raced as he stood there, clutching the Confederate flag like it was a lifeline. The weight of Corporal Whittaker's words, and the dozens of eyes fixed on him, made his palms sweat and his mind spin. He had come to London to have fun, to take silly pictures and create stories to share with his friends back home. But now, instead of being the center of attention for something amusing, he felt like he was starring in a scene from a movie gone horribly wrong. Whittaker's stern voice echoed in Mark's ears. "This is not a joke." Those 5 simple words seemed to grow heavier with each passing second. Mark tried to speak again, stumbling over his words as he searched for some way to diffuse the tension. "Look, I didn't mean any harm," he said, his voice shaky. It's just a flag. Where I'm from, people don't think much about it." But Whittaker wasn't swayed. His posture remained rigid, his gaze unrelenting. Though his face betrayed little emotion, his tone carried an authority that left no room for argument. "Sir," Whittaker replied, his voice cutting through the murmurs of the crowd, "symbols matter. And where you stand right now, they matter even more." The gravity of the situation hit Mark harder than before. He glanced down at the flag in his hands, its bold colors suddenly feeling garish and out of place against the dignified backdrop of Buckingham Palace. For the first time, he began to wonder if maybe this wasn't just a harmless prank after all. Was it possible that he misunderstood what the flag represented, not just to himself, but to others? As the whispers around him grew louder, Mark noticed subtle changes in the crowd's demeanor. Some tourists shook their heads in disapproval, while others snapped photos or recorded videos, capturing every awkward moment. A few parents ushered their children away, clearly uncomfortable with the spectacle unfolding before them. Mark couldn't help but feel like he was shrinking under the collective judgment of everyone present. He looked back up at Whittaker, hoping for some sign of leniency, some indication that the guard might soften his stance. But Whittaker's expression remained unchanged, a mask of professionalism tinged with quiet frustration. It was clear that he wasn't going to let this slide, not here, not in front of the palace, and certainly not while wearing the uniform of the British Army. Desperate to salvage the situation, Mark tried one last time to explain himself. "I swear, I didn't mean to offend anyone," he pleaded, his voice rising slightly. "I thought it'd be funny, you know. Like a quirky souvenir. I didn't realize." His words trailed off as Whittaker interrupted him with a single, sharp command. "Enough." The word hung in the air like a thunderclap, silencing both Mark and the murmuring crowd. Whittaker took a deliberate step forward, his polished boots clicking against the pavement. Though he didn't raise his voice, the intensity behind his next statement sent a shiver down Mark's spine. "Sir, you are standing near one of the most respected institutions in the world. This is not the place for ignorance or arrogance." The crowd gasped softly, and Mark felt his cheeks flush with embarrassment. He wanted to argue, to defend himself, but deep down, he knew Whittaker was right. There was no excuse for what he'd done. Slowly, reluctantly, Mark lowered the flag, folding it clumsily as his hands trembled. He avoided making eye contact with anyone, his earlier bravado completely evaporated. Just when Mark thought things couldn't get worse, two figures emerged from the edge of the crowd. Dressed in crisp uniforms, palace security officers approached him with calm but purposeful strides. Their presence signaled that this incident wasn't going to end with a simple apology. As they closed in, one of them spoke firmly but politely. "Sir, we need you to come with us." Mark's stomach dropped. He opened his mouth to protest, but no words came out. Instead, he nodded mutely, clutching the folded flag tightly as the officers flanked him on either side. The crowd parted to let them pass, some shaking their heads, others whispering heatedly. Cameras continued to flash, capturing Mark's humiliated expression as he was led away from the gates of Buckingham Palace. As they walked, Mark couldn't shake the feeling that he'd made a terrible mistake, one that would follow him far beyond this moment. The playful adventure he'd envisioned for his trip had taken a sharp turn into uncharted territory, leaving him unsure of how or if he could ever make amends. The walk to the security office felt like the longest of Mark's life. Surrounded by the two palace officers, he kept his head down, avoiding the curious stares and whispered comments from onlookers. The cheerful bustle of tourists, snapping photos and chatting animatedly seemed worlds away now. Instead, Mark was acutely aware of every step he took, the sound of his shoes tapping against the pavement echoing in his ears. His mind raced with questions. What would happen next? Would they arrest him? Was this going to ruin his trip, or worse, his reputation? When they reached a small, nondescript building tucked behind the palace grounds, one of the officers opened the door and gestured for Mark to enter. Inside, the atmosphere was calm but serious. A senior officer, dressed in a neatly pressed uniform, sat behind a desk cluttered with papers and files. His nameplate read Lieutenant Harris, and his sharp eyes immediately locked onto Mark as he entered the room. "Have a seat," Lieutenant Harris said, his tone polite but firm. Mark obeyed, sinking into the chair across from him. He clutched the folded Confederate flag tightly in his lap, as if it might somehow shield him from the weight of what was about to come. For a moment, There was silence. Lieutenant Harris studied Mark carefully, then leaned back in his chair and sighed. "Let's start with why we're here," he began, his voice measured. "Do you understand why displaying that flag caused such a reaction?" Mark hesitated, unsure how to respond. He nodded slowly, though his understanding still felt incomplete. I think so," he stammered. "It's offensive, isn't it? But where I'm from, people don't always see it that way." Harris raised an eyebrow, clearly unimpressed. "Where you're from doesn't change its meaning here, or anywhere else," he replied. "That flag is associated with a painful history of slavery, racism, and division. It's not just a regional symbol, it's a reminder of oppression for many people around the world. Bringing it here, especially near Buckingham Palace, shows a lack of awareness and respect." Mark winced at the word oppression. It wasn't something he'd ever considered when thinking about the flag. Back home, debates about it were common, but they rarely went beyond arguments over states' rights or Southern pride. To hear someone describe it in such stark terms made him feel even smaller than before. Seeing Mark's discomfort, Harris softened slightly. "Look," he continued, "we're not accusing you of being malicious. We know you probably didn't intend to cause trouble. But intentions only go so far. Actions matter, and yours today crossed a line." Mark swallowed hard, nodding again. "I get it," he said quietly. "I really do. I didn't mean to upset anyone. I swear. I thought it was funny, but now I see how wrong that was." Harris gave him a long look, weighing his words. Finally, he spoke again. "Here's what's going to happen. We're not pressing charges, but we need your assurance that this won't happen again. Not here, and hopefully not anywhere else. Do you understand?" Relief washed over Mark, but it was tinged with guilt. He nodded vigorously. "Yes, sir. Absolutely. I promise I'll be more careful moving forward." The lieutenant studied him for another moment, then leaned forward and slid a piece of paper across the desk. "Good. Then sign this document acknowledging our discussion and agreeing to behave responsibly during your stay in London." Mark picked up the pen and scribbled his name without hesitation, eager to put the ordeal behind him. As the formalities wrapped up, Harris added one final remark. "Take this as a learning experience, mister." He glanced at the signed paper. "Mark, traveling is about broadening your horizons, not reinforcing old habits. Use this opportunity to grow." With those parting words, Mark was escorted out of the office and back into the sunlight. Though the immediate crisis had passed, the weight of the incident lingered heavily on his shoulders. As he walked away from the palace grounds, he couldn't shake the feeling that he'd been given a second chance, but one he didn't fully deserve. Back at his hotel later that evening, Mark replayed the day's events in his mind, cringing at every misstep. He pulled out his phone and scrolled through social media, only to find videos of the incident already circulating online. Comments ranged from harsh criticism to outright ridicule, with hashtags like #Confederate tourist trending. Each new notification felt like a fresh wave of embarrassment crashing over him. Sitting alone in his room, Mark realized something important. Ignorance wasn't just an excuse. It was a responsibility. He had unknowingly carried a symbol of pain into a place of honor, and the consequences were far-reaching. Determined to make amends, he vowed to use this experience as a turning point. Little did he know, the hardest part was yet to come. By the time Mark returned to his hotel, the incident had already taken on a life of its own. Social media was ablaze with clips of him waving the Confederate flag at Buckingham Palace, each video accompanied by captions that ranged from mocking to outright hostile. Hashtags like #Confederate tourist and #Flag Fiasco were trending worldwide, pulling in opinions from all corners of the globe. Some commenters called him clueless, while others labeled him disrespectful or even racist. The sheer volume of reactions overwhelmed Mark as he scrolled through his phone, his face growing hotter with every notification. At first, Mark tried to ignore it, telling himself that people would eventually move on to the next viral story. But the backlash wasn't confined to online platforms. News outlets picked up the story, airing segments about the American tourist who disrespected British tradition. Photos of Mark standing awkwardly in front of the palace gate appeared alongside articles dissecting the symbolism of the Confederate flag. Even late-night comedians joked about the incident, turning it into fodder for their monologues. Mark found himself cringing at every mention, feeling as though the entire world was laughing at his expense. The humiliation didn't stop there. Friends and family back home began reaching out, some offering support but many more questioning his judgment. His cousin texted him a link to one of the viral videos, adding, "What were you thinking?" Another friend sent a meme of him photoshopped into a Civil War reenactment scene, complete with exaggerated dialogue, just here for the photo op. While some messages were lighthearted, others carried an undertone of disappointment that stung deeply. One particularly scathing message came from an old high school teacher who wrote, "I hope this teaches you how symbols can hurt people." As if the public shaming weren't enough, Mark also started receiving unsolicited advice from strangers. People slid into his social media DMs, lecturing him about cultural sensitivity and urging him to educate himself on history. A few even suggested he delete his accounts altogether to escape the scrutiny. Mark felt cornered, unsure whether to defend himself or simply disappear until the storm passed. Amid the chaos, something unexpected happened. Buried among the angry comments and sarcastic remarks, Mark stumbled upon a thread where someone had shared a thoughtful post about the origins of the Confederate flag and its global perception. The writer explained how the flag had come to represent not just Southern heritage, but also centuries of systemic oppression and division. Reading those words hit Mark harder than any insult ever could. It wasn't just that he'd embarrassed himself, it was that he'd unwittingly perpetuated harm without understanding why. That night, unable to sleep, Mark sat alone in his dimly lit hotel room, staring at the folded flag lying on the bedside table. For so long, he'd seen it as a harmless relic of his hometown's identity. Now, it felt tainted, heavy with meaning he couldn't unsee. He thought about Lieutenant Harris's parting words. "Traveling is about broadening your horizons, not reinforcing old habits." Those words echoed in his mind, pushing him toward a decision he hadn't considered before. The next morning, Mark woke up with a new sense of purpose. He knew he couldn't undo what had happened, but maybe, just maybe, he could turn this mistake into something meaningful. After doing some research, he reached out to a local community center in London that focused on multicultural education and historical awareness. To his surprise, they agreed to let him speak with a group of students later that week. When the day arrived, Mark walked into the community center feeling nervous but hopeful. The room was filled with young faces, some curious, others skeptical. As he stood before them, holding the Confederate flag in trembling hands, he took a deep breath and began to speak. "Hi everyone," he started, his voice steady despite his nerves. "My name is Mark, and I made a big mistake recently. I brought this flag to Buckingham Palace because I thought it would be funny. But I learned the hard way that symbols matter. And this one hurts a lot of people." For the next 20 minutes, Mark shared his story honestly, acknowledging his ignorance and apologizing sincerely. He admitted that he hadn't understood the flag's impact until after the incident and promised to use this experience as a chance to grow. By the end of his talk, the skepticism in the room had softened, replaced by nods of approval and quiet applause. Walking out of the center afterward, Mark felt a glimmer of redemption. He knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but for the first time since arriving in London, he felt like he was heading in the right direction. Mark's visit to the community center marked a turning point in his journey, though he knew it wouldn't magically erase the damage he'd caused. As he stepped out into the crisp London air after his talk, he felt a mix of relief and lingering unease. The students' reactions had been encouraging. Some even approached him afterward to thank him for sharing his story. But Mark couldn't shake the feeling that one heartfelt apology wasn't enough to undo the ripple effects of his actions. That evening, back at his hotel, Mark decided to take another step toward accountability. He opened his laptop and began drafting a public statement. It wasn't easy. Every word felt like walking a tightrope between explaining himself and avoiding excuses. Finally, after several drafts and countless edits, he posted the message on his social media accounts. In it, he admitted his mistake, acknowledged the harm caused by the Confederate flag, and expressed gratitude for the lessons he'd learned during his trip. "I came to London thinking I understood the world," he wrote, "but I left realizing how much I still have to learn." The response was mixed, as he expected. Some people praised his honesty and willingness to grow, while others dismissed his apology as too little, too late. One commenter wrote, "Actions speak louder than words. Prove you mean it." Another added, "It's good you're owning up, but don't expect a pat on the back for doing the bare minimum." Though the criticism stung, Mark reminded himself that growth isn't always comfortable. He resolved to let these critiques fuel his efforts rather than discourage him. Determined to follow through, Mark spent the next few days exploring London differently. Instead of snapping selfies at landmarks, he visited museums and cultural exhibits, immersing himself in stories he'd never fully considered before. At the British Museum, he lingered in front of artifacts tied to colonialism and slavery, reading about their impact on generations of people. At the Imperial War Museum, he listened intently to audio recordings of soldiers and civilians discussing the scars of war and division. Each exhibit deepened his understanding of history and his role in respecting it. One afternoon, Mark stumbled upon a small bookstore tucked away in Covent Garden. Inside, he found shelves lined with titles about global cultures, historical conflicts, and social justice. A kind-eyed shopkeeper noticed his interest and recommended a book called Symbols That Divide, Understanding Historical Flags. Mark bought it without hesitation, eager to educate himself further. As he flipped through its pages later that evening, he realized just how complex and layered symbols could be. What seemed innocuous to one person might carry decades or centuries of pain for another. Feeling inspired, Mark reached out to Lieutenant Harris, hoping to express his gratitude for the officer's guidance. To his surprise, Harris agreed to meet him for coffee near the palace grounds. Over steaming cups of tea, they discussed everything from Mark's experience at the community center to broader topics like cultural sensitivity and personal growth. Harris shared his own experiences dealing with difficult situations and offered advice on how to navigate misunderstandings with humility and grace. By the end of their conversation, Mark felt a renewed sense of determination. His final act of redemption came unexpectedly. While waiting for a bus outside Hyde Park, Mark overheard two tourists debating the significance of a nearby statue. One argued it represented freedom, while the other insisted it symbolized oppression. Recognizing an opportunity to contribute constructively, Mark joined the conversation, offering insights he'd gained during his travels. His tone was respectful, and his explanations were rooted in what he learned, not lectured or defensive. When the discussion ended, both tourists thanked him for adding perspective they hadn't considered before. As Mark boarded the bus, he reflected on how far he'd come since that fateful day at Buckingham Palace. He hadn't erased his mistake, nor had he silenced all his critics. But he'd taken meaningful steps to make amends and educate himself, proving that even missteps can lead to growth. For the first time in weeks, Mark smiled, not because he thought he'd done enough, but because he finally understood that learning never truly ends. By the time Mark's trip to London was drawing to a close, the whirlwind of emotions he'd experienced had begun to settle into something resembling clarity. The public backlash, the heartfelt apologies, and the small acts of redemption, all of it had reshaped how he viewed not just the world around him, but also his place within it. Still, as he packed his suitcase on the final morning of his stay, he couldn't help but wonder, would this experience stick with him when life returned to normal? Or would the lessons fade once he stepped back into the familiar rhythms of home? On his last day in the city, Mark decided to revisit Buckingham Palace, not out of nostalgia, but as a way to confront the scene of his biggest misstep head-on. Standing at a distance from the gates, he watched the guards stand tall and stoic, their presence as commanding as ever. This time, though, Mark didn't feel fear or shame. Instead, he felt a quiet respect for the institution they represented and for the boundaries he now understood better than before. He took a deep breath, nodded almost imperceptibly to himself, and walked away without taking a single photo. Later that afternoon, Mark made one final stop, a local cafe where he'd often grabbed coffee during his stay. It was a cozy little spot with mismatched chairs and walls adorned with vintage travel posters. As he sipped his cappuccino, he struck up a conversation with the barista, a young woman named Clara who had worked there for years. She recognized him immediately. "Aren't you the guy from the news?" she asked, raising an eyebrow. Mark winced, but nodded. "Yeah, that's me," he admitted sheepishly. "I guess I'll always be that tourist now." To his surprise, Clara chuckled warmly. "Well, everyone makes mistakes," she said. "What matters is what you do after them. And I heard you've been trying to make things right. That counts for something." Her words stayed with him long after he left the cafe. They reminded him that while people might remember his blunder, they were also watching to see how he handled it moving forward. That realization gave him hope and motivation as he boarded his flight back to the United States later that evening. When Mark landed in his hometown, he found himself facing a new challenge, explaining everything to the people closest to him. His family greeted him at the airport with hugs and questions about his trip, but their excitement quickly turned to concern when he told them about the incident. His mom sighed heavily, shaking her head. "Oh, Mark, why did you bring that flag? You know how sensitive things are these days." "I know, Mom," he replied earnestly. "That's exactly what I didn't realize until it was too late. But I'm learning, I promise." He went on to share everything he'd done since the incident, from speaking at the community center to reading books and having tough conversations. By the end of his explanation, his parents looked less disappointed and more proud of the effort he was making. Over the following weeks, Mark kept his promise to grow. He joined a local book club focused on history and social issues, pushing himself to engage with perspectives different from his own. He volunteered at a cultural exchange program, helping immigrants adjust to life in his small town. And whenever someone brought up the Confederate flag in conversation, he spoke candidly about its impact, challenging others to reconsider their assumptions. Despite these efforts, reminders of the incident occasionally popped up online. Memes and jokes about the Confederate tourist still circulated, and some strangers continued to criticize him harshly. But instead of letting it drag him down, Mark used those moments as fuel to keep improving. He knew he couldn't control what others thought or said, but he could control how he responded. One evening, as he sat on his porch flipping through the pages of Symbols That Divide, Mark reflected on how much had changed since his arrival in London. What started as a lighthearted vacation had turned into a crash course in humility, empathy, and self-awareness. He wasn't the same person who had waved that flag so carelessly. He was someone who understood the weight of symbols and the importance of respecting shared spaces. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink, Mark closed the book and leaned back in his chair. For the first time in weeks, he felt at peace, not because he'd reached perfection, but because he'd embraced the journey toward becoming better. Whatever came next, he knew he'd face it with an open mind and a willingness to listen. Months passed, and Mark's life slowly returned to its usual rhythm. The days of viral videos and trending hashtags began to fade into the background, replaced by quieter moments of reflection and growth. Yet the lessons he learned in London remained etched deeply in his mind, shaping the way he interacted with the world around him. What had started as a single misstep had blossomed into something far greater, a commitment to understanding, empathy, and change. One crisp autumn morning, Mark received an email that caught him off guard. It was from Lieutenant Harris, the senior officer who had spoken to him during the incident at Buckingham Palace. In the message, Harris thanked Mark for his efforts to make amends and share that the community center where Mark had spoken had reached out to commend his sincerity. "Your actions may not have been perfect," Harris wrote, "but your willingness to grow speaks volumes. Keep going. You're making a difference." Mark read the email several times, each word filling him with a mix of pride and renewed determination. He realized then that redemption wasn't just about fixing one mistake. It was about building a pattern of behavior that reflected the person he wanted to become. Inspired by Harris's words, Mark decided to take his journey a step further. He reached out to schools and libraries in neighboring towns, offering to give talks about cultural sensitivity and the importance of respecting symbols. To his surprise, many accepted his offer, eager to hear his story. The first presentation took place in a middle school auditorium, filled with curious teenagers. As Mark stood before them, holding up the Confederate flag he'd once waved so carelessly, he felt nervous but resolute. "This flag doesn't define me," he began, his voice steady. "But it taught me something important, that we all carry responsibility for the symbols we choose to represent us. Ignorance isn't an excuse, but it can be a starting point for learning." The students listened intently, their initial skepticism melting away as Mark spoke openly about his experience. When he finished, hands shot up across the room, asking questions and sharing thoughts. One boy raised his hand hesitantly and asked, "Do you think people will ever stop judging you for what happened?" Mark smiled softly. "Probably not," he admitted. "But I stopped letting that worry me. What matters is that I'm doing my best to be better every day." Word of Mark's talks spread quickly, earning him invitations to speak at larger events. A local university even asked him to participate in a panel discussion about cultural awareness and historical accountability. Standing alongside experts and activists, Mark felt both humbled and empowered. Though he knew he didn't have all the answers, he understood the value of sharing his story, flaws and all, to inspire others to reflect on their own actions. Back home, Mark continued to immerse himself in learning. He devoured books, attended workshops, and engaged in conversations with people from diverse backgrounds. Each new perspective enriched his understanding of the world, reminding him how much there was still to discover. His small-town neighbors noticed the shift in him too. Once seen as easygoing but somewhat oblivious, Mark now carried himself with a quiet confidence and thoughtfulness that earned him respect. One evening, while flipping through old photos from his trip, Mark paused at a picture of himself standing near Buckingham Palace. Back then, he'd been grinning widely, completely unaware of the storm that lay ahead. Now, looking at the photo, he saw not just the man he used to be, but also the man he was becoming. A work in progress, shaped by mistakes, and determined to do better. As winter approached, Mark sat down to write a letter to Corporal Whitaker, the guard whose piercing gaze had sparked his transformation. In it, he expressed his gratitude for the firm yet fair way Whitaker had handled the situation. "You could have ignored me or laughed it off," Mark wrote. "Instead, you chose to teach me a lesson I desperately needed to learn. Thank you for helping me see the bigger picture." Though he never received a reply, Mark felt lighter after sending the letter, as if he'd closed a chapter he'd long left unresolved. Life moved forward, bringing new challenges and opportunities. But no matter where Mark went or what he did, he carried the lessons of London with him. A reminder that even the most embarrassing moments can lead to profound growth. Years later, when someone would ask Mark about his travels, he'd smile knowingly and say, "London changed my life, not because it was perfect, but because it taught me that none of us are. And that's okay, as long as we're willing to grow."